Long before Wall Street existed, before credit cards, banks, or interest rates shaped our lives, humanity discovered something dangerous about debt. It grows faster than people can. In ancient Mesopotamia, 4,000 years ago, debt wasn't abstract. It wasn't paperwork. It wasn't a number on a screen. It was survival. If the harvest failed, a farmer would borrow grain. If a family fell ill, they borrowed silver. If war disrupted trade, entire villages borrowed just to live another season. At first, debt seemed harmless, a temporary arrangement between neighbors, overseen by temples and palace officials. But Mesopotamia had already invented something the world still struggles with today: interest. A farmer who borrowed 1 measure of barley owed 1.5 back. Borrow 10 shekels of silver, return 15. Every year, every season, the amount grew, quietly, invisibly, relentlessly. And soon the math became terrifying. Because while barley grew in fields, and sheep multiplied in herds, interest grew in ledgers, at a pace no family could match. A bad harvest could set a household back a year. 2 bad harvests could trap them forever. Debt didn't just follow people, it consumed them. Fathers pledged their land. Mothers pledged their children. Families pledged their own freedom. Debt wasn't just financial. It became personal, physical, generational. By the time one bad season ended, the next one arrived. Interest piled on interest. What began as a solution became a trap. And the trap didn't just ensnare individuals, it began tearing at the foundation of the kingdom. Because when too many farmers lost their land, farms stopped producing. When too many workers fell into bondage, armies had no soldiers. When too many families were enslaved by creditors, society fractured. Mesopotamian kings faced a frightening truth. Their own economy, the system they built, was devouring the people needed to sustain it. Villages emptied, fields went untended. Men fled their homes to avoid bondage. Armies weakened. Rebellions whispered through the countryside. Debt wasn't just a problem, it was an existential threat. A kingdom cannot survive when its citizens stop believing they have a future. And in ancient Mesopotamia, that future was disappearing. Not because of war, famine, or invasion, but because the numbers on a clay tablet were rising faster than civilization could keep up. It was the first time in human history that leaders realized a terrifying economic truth. If debt grows unchecked, society collapses long before the kingdom does. Debt in ancient Mesopotamia didn't just grow, it evolved. Slowly, quietly, and then all at once, it transformed from a financial tool into a weapon. What began as simple borrowing between neighbors became a system that could swallow entire families whole. And it happened because of one brutal reality. When people couldn't pay, people became payment. At first, it seemed temporary. A farmer, unable to repay a bad season's grain loan, would pledge a child to work for the creditor until the debt was cleared. A herder short on silver might offer his own labor in exchange for time. A widow might surrender her land in return for barley. But temporary arrangements have a way of becoming permanent. Interest rates in Mesopotamia were astonishingly high, often 20% on silver and 33% on grain. One failed harvest, one drought, one illness, one missed payment. And a family fell behind forever. And once the spiral began, there was no escape. Fathers pledged sons. Mothers pledged daughters. Entire households were absorbed into creditor estates. This wasn't slavery in the modern sense. It wasn't based on race or conquest. It was something more chilling. It was economic slavery, bondage created not by force, but by math. A family in debt lost more than property. They lost autonomy. They lost the right to leave, to choose, to own. Children born into indebted households inherited the obligations of their parents. Debt became a chain that reached across generations. And as more families collapsed under these obligations, something alarming happened. The economic backbone of the kingdom, farmers, herders, craftsmen, began vanishing into the households of wealthy creditors. The elite grew richer, their estates grew larger, their control grew tighter, but the kingdom itself grew weaker. Because when small farmers became debt servants, fields were neglected. Production fell. Military recruits dwindled. Tax revenues shrank. Local communities broke apart. A society built on the labor of free citizens cannot function when those citizens become captives of debt. Mesopotamian kings watched in fear as villages emptied, farmland went barren, and the number of available soldiers collapsed. Peasants fled into the desert to escape creditors. Some formed bandit groups, others abandoned royal lands entirely. The kings realized something dangerously simple. A creditor might gain a servant, but the king loses a citizen. The math was undeniable. If debt slavery continued, the kingdom itself would hollow out from within. The economy wasn't just imbalanced, it was becoming unsustainable, a system eating the very people it needed to survive. And soon, the kings would be forced to take a step no modern government has dared repeat. A step that wiped the slate clean, not out of kindness, but out of survival. Debt didn't just ruin families in Mesopotamia, it began to ruin kingdoms. By the time debt slavery spread across the land, Mesopotamian rulers faced a crisis unlike war, famine, or invasion. This wasn't an enemy they could fight with soldiers. It wasn't a drought they could pray away. It wasn't a rebellion they could crush. It was a collapse growing silently inside their own economy, a collapse their own laws had created. Across the countryside, something alarming began to happen. The poor stopped showing up. Farmers abandoned their fields. Herders deserted their flocks. Workers fled their villages and disappeared into the desert. Why? Because staying meant bondage. Leaving meant freedom. Even if that freedom came with starvation or exile. Entire regions became hollow. Fields lay barren, producing nothing for the temples or the palace. Armies that once drew recruits from free landowners found their numbers shrinking. Royal tax collectors returned with empty ledgers and excuses. Debt wasn't just a financial problem. It was dismantling the state piece by piece. When creditors gained more power than kings, the kingdom itself began to fracture. Wealthy elites, who should have supported the throne, started absorbing land, people, and influence. Their households grew into miniature states, while the palace struggled to maintain authority. This was the nightmare scenario. A kingdom where the rich grew richer, the poor fled or fell into bondage, and the king's power evaporated in the middle. Rebellions simmered beneath the surface. Not organized armies, but something more dangerous. A population that no longer believed the system could protect them. Once faith disappears, order follows. The clay tablets from this era read like warning sirens, lists of runaway families, unpaid taxes, abandoned villages, empty granaries. The kings knew what these records truly were, signs of a society cracking under the weight of its own economic machinery. If nothing changed, the kingdom would collapse without an enemy ever crossing its borders. Mesopotamian rulers realized a terrifying truth. Their biggest threat wasn't foreign invasion, it was internal implosion. The economy had become a trap that punished the very people it depended upon. The state was cannibalizing its own strength. The social fabric was tearing faster than kings could mend it. Mesopotamia stood at the edge of a cliff, and one misstep could send the entire civilization into ruin. Something had to be done, something radical, unprecedented, almost unthinkable. And it would change the fate of kingdoms for centuries, a royal decree that would erase the past to save the future. At the moment when Mesopotamian kingdoms seemed destined to collapse under their own economic weight, something extraordinary happened, something so radical, so disruptive, that modern governments wouldn't dare attempt it today. The kings erased the debt, all of it. With a single royal decree, the clay tablets listing personal debts, the records that bound families, land, and labor to wealthy creditors, were smashed, washed, or burned. Debt servants were freed. Land was returned to its original owners. Families torn apart by obligations were reunited. Interest contracts vanished as if they had never existed. This was called amargi, masharum, or andurarum depending on the kingdom. But history remembers it by a simpler name, the Debt Jubilee, the world's first economic reset. It was not charity, it was not mercy, it was maintenance. a necessary reboot to prevent society from ripping itself apart. A jubilee wasn't declared at random. It came at moments of maximum instability, when too many farmers were enslaved, too much land had shifted into elite hands, too many villages were empty, and too many soldiers had abandoned the kingdom to escape bondage. The kings weren't forgiving debt out of kindness. They were doing it to survive. Because a kingdom with no free farmers has no food. A kingdom with no independent households has no army. A kingdom where creditors own everything eventually becomes a kingdom that cannot function. The Jubilee was the king pulling the emergency brake, and it worked. Overnight, free citizens returned to their land. Runaways came home. Fields were planted again. Local economies came back to life. The tax base was restored. The army regained recruits. For a brief moment, a breath between crises, society reset to balance. But these proclamations did something even more profound. They reminded everyone that the king, not the creditor, ruled the land. By wiping out debts, rulers reasserted the hierarchy. Subjects owed loyalty to the king, not bondage to elites. Labor belonged to the kingdom, not private ledgers. It was a political masterstroke disguised as economic mercy. But it came with a hidden truth, a truth as old as civilization itself. Debt grows faster than societies can contain. And without resets, every system eventually traps its own people. Mesopotamian kings weren't erasing numbers. They were erasing a threat that modern economies still fear, but no longer dare to restart. When a Mesopotamian king declared a debt jubilee, it wasn't just an economic announcement. It was a shockwave, a reset that rippled through every village, every farm, every household. Overnight, the social order shifted. The kingdom didn't just reopen, it rebooted, and the transformation was immediate. Families who had fled into the desert returned home. Land that had been seized by wealthy creditors flowed back to small farmers. Fields that had gone barren were plowed again. Children who had been pledged as debt servants ran free back to their families. The economy exhaled for the first time in years. A society on the verge of collapse suddenly became functional again. Because when you erase personal debt, you erase fear. And when you erase fear, people start building again. But the Jubilee didn't just restore individuals. It restored the entire structure of civilization. The heart of Mesopotamian power was its small farmers, independent households who produced food, paid taxes, raised soldiers, and formed the backbone of society. When those farmers became debt slaves, the whole kingdom weakened. But once a jubilee freed them, the kingdom regained its workforce, its tax base, its army, and its stability. The economy came back to life not because money changed hands, but because people did. Freed from bondage, farmers returned to their land with a renewed sense of purpose. Herds expanded, harvests improved, trade revived, markets reopened. Within months, the king's authority strengthened, not through force, but through restored trust. A jubilee was an act of political engineering disguised as compassion. It rebalanced the system in a way no court or tax policy ever could. It reminded creditors of their limits. It reminded citizens of their value. It reminded the kingdom that the economy existed to serve society, not the other way around. But something deeper happened too. A jubilee reset the psychology of the nation. People who once felt trapped by obligations regained hope. They could plan again, invest again, marry again, raise families again. The future belonged to them, not to the clay tablets listing their debts. This emotional reset was just as important as the economic one. Civilizations don't collapse because numbers rise. They collapse when people stop believing tomorrow will be better than today. The debt jubilee restored that belief. It didn't erase human nature or greed or inequality. It didn't create utopia. But it bought the kingdom something far more valuable. Time. Time to rebuild. Time to stabilize. Time to breathe before the next storm. It was a reset button for civilization. A button the modern world desperately needs, but no longer remembers how to press. When Mesopotamian kings wiped the slate clean, they weren't being idealistic. They weren't dreamers, radicals, or utopians. They were realists, leaders who understood something we've forgotten. A society drowning in debt cannot survive. Mesopotamia learned this 4,000 years ago. The modern world has not. Today, the idea of a debt jubilee sounds impossible, even dangerous. Economists scoff, politicians panic, and financial markets recoil. Debt, we're told, is the backbone of modern growth. Credit fuels consumption, investment, innovation. Entire industries rely on it. Entire governments run on it. But beneath the complexity, the world faces the same problem ancient kings confronted. Debt grows faster than people do, and when debt grows unchecked, the outcome is always predictable. The rich turn into creditors. The poor turn into collateral. Families fall behind. Inequality widens. Society fractures. And eventually, the system begins to eat itself. Mesopotamian rulers recognized the danger early. They saw communities hollowing out, fields abandoned, armies shrinking, and elites consolidating power at the expense of the kingdom. They understood that debt wasn't just a financial burden. It was a political threat, a social toxin, a slow-moving collapse. So they reset the system. They restored balance before imbalance became irreversible. Today, we go in the opposite direction. Instead of jubilees, we get bailouts. Instead of freeing people, we rescue institutions. Instead of wiping slates, we refinance them. Instead of resetting economies, we stretch them until they snap. Modern debt isn't recorded on clay tablets, it's typed onto screens. But the math hasn't changed. The consequences haven't changed. The fragility hasn't changed. Household debt is soaring. National debts are astronomical. Student loans, medical bills, credit cards, the modern forms of bondage expand year after year. And just like in ancient Mesopotamia, the pressure is pushing people to the breaking point. We're repeating the same pattern the ancient world escaped, but without the courage to use the tool they invented. Debt jubilees disappeared not because they failed, but because they threatened the powerful, the creditors who benefit when obligations never die. The kings of Mesopotamia understood a truth modern leaders refuse to face. A society is stronger when its citizens are free, not financially shackled. The ancient world knew something we pretend not to know. Resetting the system doesn't destroy it, it saves it. The debt jubilee wasn't a relic, it was a solution, one we might have to remember before history reminds us the hard way.